The Call of the Wild 6 of 20. 여러분 안녕하세요. 야성의 부름 20편 나눠 읽기 6번째 시간입니다. 슬라이드 화면 22개로 구성하였습니다. 소설책은 33페이지에서 39페이지까지 7페이지 분량입니다. 오늘도 초등학교 1학년 학생 김준빈 군이 지원 사격을 나왔습니다. 마지막 페이지 140페이지를 향해서 출발하겠습니다.
Chapter 3, The Dominant Primordial Beast. The dominant primordial beast was strong in bulk, and under the fierce condition of trail life, it grew and grew. Yet it was a secret growth. His newborn cunning gave him pose and control. He was too busy adjusting himself to the new life to feel at ease. And not only did he not pick fights, but he avoided them whenever possible. A certain deliberateness characterized his attitude.
He was not prone to rashness and precipitate action, and in the bitter hatred between him and speech, he betrayed no impatience, shunned all offensive acts. On the other hand, possibly because he divined in Buck a dangerous rival, speech never lost an opportunity of showing his teeth. He even went out of his way to bully Buck, striving constantly to start a fight, which could end only in the death of one or the other. Early in the trip, this might have taken place had it not been for an unwarranted accident. At the end of this day, they made a bleak and miserable camp on the shore of Lake Baji. Driving snow, a wind that cut like a white-hot knife, and darkness had forced them to grope for a camping place. They could hardly have fared worse. At their backs rose a perpendicular wall of rocks, and Perrault and Francois were compelled to make their fire and spread their sleeping robes on the ice of the lake itself. The tents they had discarded at Dai in order to travel light. A few sticks of driftwood furnished them with a fire that thawed down through the ice and left them to eat supper in the dark. Closing under the sheltering rock, Buck made his nest. So snug and warm was it that he was loath to leave it when Francois distributed the fish which he had first thawed over the fire. But when Buck finished his ration and returned, he found his nest occupied. A warning snare told him that the trespasser was speech. Till now, Buck had avoided trouble with his enemy, but this was too much. The beast in him roared. He sprang upon Speech with a fury which surprised them both, and Speech particularly, for his whole experience with Buck had gone to teach him that his rival was an unusually timid dog who managed to hold his own only because of his great weight and size. Francois was surprised, too, when they shot out in a tangle from the disrupted nest, and he divined the cause of the trouble. "Ah," he cried to Buck, "give it to him! By God, give it to him, the dirty thief!" Speech was equally willing. He was crying with sheer rage and eagerness as he circled back and forth for a chance to spring in. Buck was no less eager and no less cautious, as he likewise circled back and forth for the advantage. But it was then that the unexpected happened, the thing which projected their struggle for Sporemus far into the future, past many a weary mile of trail and toil. An oath from Perrault, the resounding impact of a club upon a body frame, and the shrill yelp of pain heralded the breaking forth of pandemonium. The camp was suddenly discovered to be alive with skulking furry forms, starving huskies, 4 or 5 squaw of them, who had scented the camp from some Indian village. They had crept in while Buck and Speech were fighting, and when the two men sprang among them with stout clubs, they showed their teeth and fought back. They were crazed by the smell of the food. Perrault found one with head buried in the grub box. His club landed heavily on the gaunt ribs, and the grub box was capsized on the ground. On the instant, a square of the famished brutes were scrambling for the bread and bacon. The clubs fell upon them unheeded. They yelped and howled under the rain of blows, but struggled none the less madly till the last crumb had been devoured. In the meantime, the astonished team dogs had burst out of their nests, only to be set upon by the fierce invaders. Never had Buck seen such dogs. It seemed as though their bones would burst through their skins. They were mere skeletons, draped loosely in draggled hides, with blazing eyes and slavered fangs. But the hunger madness made them terrifying, irresistible. There was no opposing them. The team dogs were swept back against the cliff at the first onset. Buck was beset by 3 huskies, and in a trice his head and shoulders were ripped and slashed. The din was frightful. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Solex, dripping blood from a score of wounds, were fighting bravely side by side. Joe was snapping like a demon. Once his teeth closed on the foreleg of a husky, and he crunched down through the bone. Pike, the malingerer, leaped upon the crippled animal, breaking its neck with a quick flash of teeth and a jerk. Buck got a frothing adversary by the throat and was sprayed with blood when his teeth sank through the jugular. The warm taste of it in his mouth goaded him to greater fierceness. He flung himself upon another, and at the same time felt teeth sink into his own throat. It was speech, treacherously attacking from the side. Pero and Francois, having cleaned out their parts of the camp, hurried to save their sled dogs. The wide wave of famished beasts rolled back before them, and Buck shook himself free. The 2 men were compelled to run back to save the crop, upon which the huskies returned to the attack on the team. Billy, terrified into bravery, sprang through the savage circle and fled away over the ice. Pike and Dub followed on his heels, with the rest of the team behind. As Buck drew himself together to spring after them, out of the tail of his eye he saw Spitz rush upon him with the evident intention of overthrowing him. Once off his feet, under that mass of huskies, there was no hope for him. But he braced himself to the shock of Spitz's charge, then joined the flights out on the lake. Later, the 9 team dogs gathered together and sought shelter in the forest. Though on pursuit, they were in a sorry plight. There was not one who was not wounded in 4 or 5 places, while some were wounded grievously. Dub was badly injured in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team at Die, had a badly torn throat. Joe had lost an eye, while Billy, the good-natured, with an ear chewed and ran to ribbons, cried and whimpered throughout the night. At daybreak, they limped wearily back to camp to find marauders gone and the 2 men in bad tempers. Fully half their grub supply was gone. The huskies had chewed through the sled lashings and canvas coverings. In fact, nothing, no matter how remotely eatable, had escaped them. They had eaten a pair of Paris moose-hide moccasins, chunks out of the leather traces, and even 2 feet of lash from the end of Francois' whip. He broke from a mournful contemplation of it to look over his wounded dogs. "Oh, my friends," he said softly, "maybe it make you mad dog, those many bites? Maybe all mad dog, sacred arm. What you think, Pero?" The courier shook his head dubiously. With 400 miles of trail still between him and Dawson, he could ill afford to have madness break out among his dogs. 2 hours of cursing and exertion got the harnesses into shape, and the wound-stiffened team was on the way, struggling painfully over the hardest parts of the trail. they had yet encountered, and for that matter, the hardest between them and Dawson. The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild water defied the frost, and it was in the eddies only, and in the quiet places that the ice held at all. 6 days of exhausting toil were required to cover those 30 terrible miles. And terrible they were, for every foot of them was accomplished at the risk of life to dog and man. A dozen times Pero, noticing the way, broke through the ice bridge, being saved by the long pole he carried, which he so held that it fell each time across the hole made by his body. But a cold snap was on, the thermometer registering 50 below zero, and each time he broke through he was compelled for very life to build a fire and dry his garments. Nothing daunted him. It was because nothing daunted him that he had been chosen for a government career. He took all manner of risks, resolutely thrusting his riddle-visioned face into the frost, and struggling on from dim dawn to dark. He skirted the frowning shores on rim ice that bent and crackled underfoot, and upon which they dared not halt. Once the sled broke through with Dave and Bob, and they were half frozen and all but drowned by the time they were dragged out. The usual fire was necessary to save them. They were coated solidly with ice, and the two men kept them on the run around the fire, sweating and thawing so close that they were singed by the flame.